have with us tonight several experts in the field of fashion history and in contemporary fashion. And they're going to help us think about the changing nature of fashion from the 1890s, decade by decade, until today. And we're really here to celebrate this extremely comprehensive history of fashion. You see the display copy right there, The History of Modern Fashion, with the authors Daniel James Cole and Nancy Deihl, and with experts in the field, Rebecca Kelly and Ray Smith. This impressive book is a major accomplishment in terms of scope and breadth. And with over 600 amazing images, it is really a treat for the eye. So I do hope you'll take a look at it before you leave this evening. The images range from amazing color lithographs from the 1890s to some of the fashion icons we all know and love, Marlene Dietrich, Josephine Baker, Halle Berry, and others. Unfortunately, the one downside of the evening is we don't have the books on sale for you this evening, but we do have discount postcards. They're right in front of the book display, and you can help yourself to one of those postcards. You can order the book online at a 35% discount, and it'll be delivered conveniently to your home, so you don't have to carry it home tonight because it's quite a tome. It's heavy. As you'll hear tonight from Cole and Deihl, dress is not only important from an aesthetic point of view, but also because fashion illustrates and illuminates social and cultural changes over time, and this book clearly demonstrates that phenomenon. I'm going to introduce our moderator and then turn the evening over to her. Rebecca Kelly is a dress historian and an instructor at the Fashion Institute of Technology. At FIT, she teaches classes relating to many aspects of textile and fashion history in both the Graduate School and the Department of Art History and Museum Professions. Rebecca's research interests include the history of resort and sport fashion, and she contributed to the 2005 Berg publication, 20th Century American Fashion. She holds a BA in art history, as well as a master's degree specializing in dress history and textile conservation from the University of Rhode Island. So Rebecca, without further ado, it's to you.
Well, thank you very much, Gwyneth. I'm honored and thrilled to be here tonight to moderate this great discussion about modern fashion. And I think to go ahead and get started, I'll introduce the rest of my panelists here. I'm really happy to introduce Ray Smith, who's sitting here alongside me. Ray is a fashion reporter at the Wall Street Journal. He has covered menswear, women's fashion, luxury goods, publicly traded apparel companies, and retail at the Journal for over the past 10 years. So we're really thrilled that he could join us this evening. So thank you, Ray.
Thank you.
So moving along, Nancy Deihl. Nancy has been with the NYU Costume Studies Department since 2003, first as program coordinator and since 2011 as director. Formerly a curator and a consultant in contemporary and modern art, Professor Deihl specializes in the history of fashion from 1850 to the present. She teaches courses in the literature and methodology of costume studies, history of textiles, and contemporary dress. In addition to the history of modern fashion, Cole co-authored with Daniel James Cole. Writing and editorial projects include contributions to Oxford Art Online and articles and presentations on a variety of fashion-related topics. She holds a BA in art history from Rutgers University and an MA in costume studies from New York University. So, perfect. Welcome, Nancy. I'd also like to introduce Daniel James Cole. He is on the faculty of the NYU Graduate Costume Studies Department, where he teaches 20th century fashion history and dress and textiles in world cultures. He also teaches history of costume and costume design at the Fashion Institute of Technology. He has appeared at academic conferences around the world, and his articles have been published in the Journal of the International Foundation for Fashion Technology Institutes, in the French language journal Search Mode, and in Persuasions, the online journal of the Jane Austen Society of North America. He earned his MFA in costume design from NYU Tisch School of the Arts. So, welcome, Daniel. Well, I guess I wanted to say congratulations to start with. The book was such a pleasure to look over and spend some quality time with in recent weeks. The book is a wonderful and I think much needed addition to the field of modern dress studies. One of the classes I teach at FIT is 20th century art and fashion, and I'm really thrilled to have this as a resource. The book is so thorough, as Gwyneth mentioned, and beautifully illustrated, and addresses both menswear and children's wear as well as women's wear. So that is also something that I'm really thrilled about. I also particularly like that the book begins in 1850, when women were for sure grappling with corsets and hoop skirts that had really been in their wardrobes since the Renaissance. So it really does provide that important comparative basis that I think other books that maybe start right on 1900 are somewhat lacking. So my first question for you is really, when would you say does modern fashion begin? And, why does it happen then? What drives it? And does this notion of modernity and dress differ when we consider men and women's clothing? So a tough one, but...
You go ahead and start.
All right. First of all, thanks for all your kind words about the book. This is very gratifying for us to be able to celebrate it in this way. And regarding the issue of modernity and starting with 1850, those are two distinctly related ideas. By 1850, one of the things that was really important in fashion and in clothing in general was the fact that it could be industrially produced. So we think that a lot of the modernity in modern fashion starts when you have things like the sewing machine and power looms and standardized sizing. All that stuff is modern. That's a couple things. And I know Daniel wants to add some more.
Yeah, and there's other aspects of like that 1850 dividing line too, in that things that you mentioned, the hoop skirts, but by the mid-1850s, when the cage crinoline hoop skirt came back into fashion, or was in fashion, supposedly new, but not, the materials used to make the hoops often was sprung steel. And how modern would you feel to be walking around with a hoop skirt made out of sprung steel instead of wood or bone, and as you walk down the street, your skirt would be going boing, 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 slowly. And that's a recorded phenomenon. Also, in this time, we have the development of aniline dyes, and that is setting forth the idea of synthetic processes that are used in the making of clothing, too. And so I think those sort of couple with what Nancy just said. It's a reason why we started it at 1850, and as we say in the foreword, we started at 1850 and we call it modern. Yeah.
And I just want to add one more thing, that because there's mechanization, another thing that develops is like an elite kind of class of clothing and clothing creators that's set apart from mechanization. And so that's really modern too, because that's where our kind of contemporary system of fashion really starts. So that was another reason we wanted to start there.
Perfect. Ray, did you want to chime in or?
Well, I had a question about the significance of the aniline dye, because the dyes previous to that were poisonous. Is that right, or was that?
Most of them were natural, and there were some arsenic-based dyes that were poisonous.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a really popular shade of green that was poisonous. Yeah.
And is there someone in particular who's responsible for inventing or realizing that it could be applied to this?
William Perkin, who was a chemistry graduate student in London. He later became Sir William Perkin. And the story is that he developed it by accident when he was trying to make something else utilizing coal tar. So it actually is kind of a sustainability exercise for us to see garbage being turned into something else, which again makes it modern.
Exactly.
Exactly.
True. Okay, great. So moving along, I have another somewhat long and wordy question perhaps, but here we go. As scholars, I think we're always working and building on the scaffolding of great scholars who came before us. And I like to tell my students, the good news is the work is never done. So keep going and going. We're always just trying to think more critically, to add more nuanced insight. And I was just wondering, what did you feel was most important to include in your book that you feel was perhaps missing from the overall narrative of discussions of contemporary fashion, or something that you felt was maybe continually misinterpreted? Nancy and Daniel and I were, had this term sort of myth busting in a conversation that we had. So I was just wondering, what were some of the myths that you wanted to debunk with this book?
You start this.
Okay, a lot of these myths really are salient to like 1930s and before. I think one of the biggest ones is that Charles Frederick Worth invented the couture system, which if you are a fashion history student of any sort in the audience, you probably will have heard that myth. And that's complete nonsense. And one of my published papers talks about how it's complete nonsense. But Worth came into a system that already existed, and during Worth's lifetime, he certainly helped, along with other designers, make the couture system grow very significantly. And Worth's story is just one of several where we want to attach a ground zero moment to a designer in particular, which I'm going to go as far as to say that's like always nonsense. Gabrielle Chanel did not invent black dresses. Please stop blogging that. Okay. And Paul Poiret did not revolutionize women's wear in 1908, despite the fact that I probably have 10 textbooks on my own shelf that says that he does. And those were some of the very specific things that Nancy and I went to address. Actually, when we were writing the chapter on 1900, I was getting ready to write that Paul Poiret did change the women's wear drastically in 1908, and then I couldn't find any primary source material to support it. So if you're drastically changing the way women dress overnight, the New York Times fashion column is going to cover it, right? So, Nancy?
Yeah, and one thing that we were also really focused upon is, even though we took a decades approach, which we understood could be kind of controversial, but we also feel as instructors, that's how we organize our semester. So we went with decades, but we want to make clear that on New Year's Eve, 1899, no one flips the switch and then the next day everybody starts wearing something new, because we all know that there's a transition period and you decide whether you like a new style, whether it's going to work for you, etc. So we were really concentrating on telling the story of transitions. So that's a little bit about myth busting too. And I think it's also that nuance that you mentioned, where we also had a really pretty indulgent editor who may have wanted us to be a little bit, less dealing with transitions, but we got those transitions in there.
And in one respect, it's notable that we end each chapter with a small section talking about how the coming decade is sort of emerging from the chrysalis of the previous one. And so we kind of continually tie in those traditions to help avoid the idea of, okay, we turn the page from 1970 to 1980, and suddenly we're going from flower power to moosed hair, because there's steps that take us from those places.
One of the things I found intriguing is this idea of the myth busting, because in fashion, even today, there's a publicity machine, obviously. And if you have the right publicist and you have the right celebrities sort of wearing and carrying on that story, you get sort of these tales that sort of take on this larger status. And then sometimes reporters like myself or at the New York Times fall victim to it as well, because it's been repeated so many times. But I think one of the things that happens, it seems like it's happened in that case as well, is there are just people who have a vested interest in promoting a certain story, and the designer won't, or the designer's people won't go out of their way to correct that.
Yeah.
And they almost come to believe it in a way. And so it takes researchers like yourselves to actually to bust those myths. There was another thing that you brought up that I wanted to talk about. When you talked about the decades approach, as you know, like even designers will talk about fashion in decades, like
Right.
I'm feeling 60s or I'm feeling a 30s moment. I just came from a presentation yesterday for a collection called Pre-Fall, which is another book, right?
Another issue, right?
Yeah, and so, and the designer said, well, this is a little 30s, a little 90s, and a little 60s, and it's like, whoa, that's a lot. But that's how the fashion industry sort of tends to think. Even though there are gradual steps to that decade, there are moments or something central that happens in that decade that you can point to as definitely 70s or definitely 90s or definitely 50s, even though it wasn't for the full 10 years, but there's a part of it where it becomes so intrinsic and so widespread that you can identify it.
I completely agree with you. And in fact, tomorrow I'm talking about the 1970s to a group of people. And one of the points I really want to make is that, like, for example, the 60s, what we think of as the 60s doesn't really kick in until like 1965. Right. So, and it almost ends in 1968. So
the
it's
same
like,
is true of the 20s. The 20s
Right.
doesn't start until 1925, and then it ends promptly in 1928. You know, what our stereotype
Right,
of the
right.
20s is, yeah.
So, but we still, that's the way we organize our thoughts. And designers are a great example of that. I mean, I love that. I'm feeling like the 90s through the 30s, and I'm looking at the 50s. I think that's so, it's so postmodern.
Great. Well, let's see. What do I have next? Well, one of the things that I really love about the book is that you don't talk about fashion in a vacuum. And I always say that on the first day of class to my students. You know, we have to talk about fashion as it's very interconnected to social history, the history of economics and business, politics, and technology, and of course, the fine arts. So fashion is really a completely captivating window from which to view history. And I was wondering, what are some of the circumstances in which you feel that fashion acted as a powerful cultural barometer, perhaps in some cases predicting maybe even, or in others reacting to or reflecting important social, economic, or political happenings?
Yes. You know, and actually I might introduce a couple pictures here.
Absolutely.
Because it's such a visual field. We do have, I'm just like hesitant to, lose this thing here. But we talk about context a lot. And we think it's really important to, although we didn't spend all our images on pictures of art, we thought it was really important to get a lot of them in there. So, for example, we show this as being part of the context of the 1890s. This is an image of the bar at Maxime's, the famous Parisian night spot.
And it's kind of the stereotype of what you think the decadent 1890s in Paris might be.
But then we also contrast it in the same chapter with this wonderful image of these four young women in Atlanta who obviously feel the influence of the Gibson Girl. This is much more like the reality of the 1890s. And likewise, this wonderful image of Christian Dior with his model Renee in 1954 kind of has this, welcome to couture look.
I love that picture.
Should we look at it a moment longer? I love it too. In fact, we considered this for the cover
This
for a
almost
while.
was the cover,
Yeah, we love this so much. But then the reality, again, of the 1950s is probably closer to this, right?
And so throughout, to kind of like touch on what Rebecca was saying about the context, is we wanted to continually illustrate these different contexts as we also discussed them. You talk about like direct relations and things, such as like in World War I, sort of the craziness of those years in Europe led to silhouettes that constantly were changing during the course of 4 years. And it also led to shortages of certain dye colors. So those kind of events are very important. The way people dressed in Berlin during the Weimar Republic was shockingly different than the way people dressed in, say, even London or certainly a place like Chicago. So, and I think that's also important, how the situation of the times is going to lead to changes in clothing.
Yeah, and if we think about, different cities and London in particular, and we think about the 1960s in London and the huge experimentation with materials, so that puts it in the context of like new developments in technology too. So I think that's one of the places that new materials always kind of end up quickly is like in fashion somehow.
We're pioneers, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Right.
Going back to sprung steel and animal.
Right.
Exactly. So anything, Ray, that you wanted to add? Or
I was curious if it still holds today in terms of the context, and whether you feel designers respond, or even if it's just something that happens without them even being conscious of it. Everybody talks about the economy, for instance. So how is that going to affect design, or what they show down the runways? Is it going to be tamped down, or is it going to be extravagant because we need to be put in a better mood? And I wonder if you think it works that way, or it's not that simple.
I can speak for myself, and I think for you too. I firmly believe in like a fashion zeitgeist, and I don't think it's necessarily like a one-way influence. Designers definitely influence, but also they're looking and seeing what's already out in the world, and they're kind of bringing it back to them, maybe making a luxury version of something. But I would say there's art, and there's fashion, and there's technology, and theater, and the movies. All this stuff is really kind of working together to create like an image of a certain time and place.
Social media also. I will never forget Proenza Schooler had a collection that was based on images they saw on Tumblr. And they basically put together dresses that were just these collages. And I think social media is also playing a role in terms of what they're absorbing.
In the last chapter of the book, I wrote a sidebar about the motif of homelessness in fashion. And the sort of crux of it was the fame of a Chinese homeless man strictly because of his presence on the internet, being snapped, and then other people going to follow him. So that is totally new, technologies that are very about the decade we just passed affecting us. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
Great, and I really enjoyed all the sidebars in the book. I thought it was really, really effective. So it's
Thank you.
Beautifully organized as well. And speaking of that, you do use many different types of illustrations in the book, like you were saying, and here we've already gotten a sense of some of the variety of them. And I think that you really tried to still tell the story of the history of fashion, not just from Harper's Bazaar or Vogue's point of view. So I really like that you included lots of advertisements, candid photographs, film stills, things about television, images, ads, and things like that, that were talking about what was going on in the time period. So do you want to give us a little insight into the image gathering process?
Yeah, well, we used the special collections at Fashion Institute of Technology a great deal. We had a very nice deal with them. And from a logistical issue, we had a wonderful picture editor. I even used some of my ancestors' photographs in early chapters of the book because I owned the rights to them, right? That was simple. Called in a lot of favors.
Yes,
the frontispiece photograph is by my friend Surachai, who's the lead photographer for L'Officiel Thailand. So, we really contributed to those 600 images very diligently. One thing that we found, though, was that how fashion information could be found in many different ways and in different media above and beyond the sort of expected ones, such as runways and advertisements. Sheet music reflected fashion. Do you want me to take us through all of this?
Yes.
Okay. Sheet music. Here we can see for Jenny Lind, who was she kind of prefigured Beatlemania in terms of her rabid fan base. And then here we have in the 1920s, very fashionable hair, dress, a tuxedo, something that was getting more prominent in the 1920s, but it's on sheet music. And here we have into the 1940s, Vera Lynn singing a wartime song. I want you to notice how Vera Lynn's name is being used in the graphics to make
The V for victory.
For victory. She was lucky to be born named Vera to become a big star during the war. And then there were other things, theatrical posters. Here is a poster for the opera Louise from 1900, which is an opera that's actually set in the fashion industry. Louise is a seamstress, and you can see they're in Montmartre looking over the city. But then that takes us up to a 1970s poster for the play For Colored Girls, which reflects the vogue for headscarves and earrings that were being worn not only by African American women at the time, but into the mainstream as well. And sometimes we would find conflicting images during the same decade, such as these two images of women during the 1950s. It's a comparison that my students have all seen, but where we contrast the Pulp Fiction cover with the ideal woman who's vacuuming in her lovely late day dress. We mentioned film stills, of course, and this one we were very happy to find. That our picture editor found this one because it gave us both women's wear that contrasted, and a variety of menswear too. So there was a lot of bang for our buck with this illustration. And then there were, of course, museum objects, and we tried to illustrate museum objects that weren't as often seen. Many people have told me that a lot of the images in the book are unfamiliar to them, which is something Nancy and I really strived for. I saw this at the Philadelphia Museum, which is a paper shirt. Went along with the paper dress fad of the late 1960s, but this one was intended for a man, and it's got the names of all of these sex symbols of the time on it. Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
It's pretty wild.
I remember seeing this on an exhibition in Philadelphia and just being,
yes,
OMG, and we got it. And then often we were torn sometimes. Did we want to show the museum object, or did we want to find the same dress in an original fashion shoot? In this instance, we went for the image on the right. And then every now and then Nancy or I would be traveling and we'd see something in a museum and we would just be like,
gotta get this in.
We have to get this. And I saw this Picasso in the museum in Cleveland. I'd never seen it before. I turned the corner. My friend that I was with said, Daniel, did you see this painting? This ought to be in your book. And I was like, OMG. And we had to fight to get this one into the book because the rights have been reasserted on the Picasso estate, despite the fact it's 125 years old. But we were able to keep it, and I think it says so much. And then this one I saw at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art by Kirchner, and not only was it a great example of hats of the 1910s and coats, but as we did more research on the painting, we realized that these were seamstresses that were depicted in the painting. And then the last one, which I saw at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery in about 2008, was this painting by Rebecca Westcott, who had won a major national grant from the Smithsonian, but had suddenly passed away. And she painted her friend, the Philadelphia painter Isaac Lynn, and Rebecca's husband gave us the rights to it. And both this one and the last one are chapter opening images. We always open each chapter with either a piece of fashion illustration or a piece of fine art to kind of reinforce that photography is not the only medium through which 20th century fashion was shown.
That's just a quick trip through a variety of media that we thought were really important for different reasons.
Yeah. Ray, anything that you wanted to add or
No, that was
captivating?
great.
Yeah, no, it was amazing. So something else that is really fantastic about this book is that you go really beyond the surface in regards to the designers. You know, we all know the names Gabrielle, Coco Chanel, and Christian Dior. But in making my way through the book, you know, I was so thrilled to see Louise Boulanger, Jean Patou, Jessie Franklin Turner, Adele Simpson, Vera Maxwell, Hardy Amies, Norman Hartnell, all of these beloved designers who I think are really in the shadows of fashion history or a little bit unsung heroes. So what designer in your minds was most important to really get into the book and out there for scholars to learn more about?
Well, the first one for me was John Redfern and Charles Poynter Redfern, who those of you who know me will understand that, who are both omitted from every other fashion history survey I know. And John Redfern was really equal to Charles Frederick Worth in terms of his impact on 19th century fashion. Charles Poynter Redfern, who was a junior partner, not actually a family member, was the first fashion designer to win the Légion d'honneur. And that history has neglected them. And following some scholarship done by Susan North at the Victoria and Albert Museum, once I found Susan's work, I was able to say, okay, we can set the record straight on this one. We also, go ahead, Nancy. Yeah.
Oh, I also was pretty keen on Jean Patou because I think Chanel really has eclipsed him, but he was really important in his own time. And so with this book, we wanted to make sure that the people that were important in their own time were recognized, and it, you know, rather than just us looking back and deciding now who was important, because it's it's not always accurate, let's put it that way. So I was kind of interested in him.
And there's another designer who actually during the course of researching the book became a friend of mine, who's Sandra Garrett, who was really well known for her line in the late 1980s, Multiples. And I felt like Multiples was totally emblematic of the sort of techno-pop modular concepts of the late 1980s. She gave me an interview upon which the paragraph is based. And again, she's so momentous to the time, yet forgotten by other 20th century books that talk about the 1980s.
And during we weren't able to do a ton of research, but we were almost kind of introducing a couple designers, including Maison Felix. And we did not illustrate this dress. This is in the collection of the FIDM in Los Angeles, but this dress is such a knockout.
And more information about Felix continues to kind of rise to the surface. I found some more information about the house today with the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And these are things that we didn't have access to when we started writing the book, but hopefully we'll be able to get some more information here. The black dress in John Singer Sargent's Madame X has been attributed to Maison Felix. A designer I discovered when I was in Melbourne speaking at a conference was Katie Pye, who was really well recognized in the 1980s, and a number of celebrities, including Penelope Tree, wore her clothes, and she was considered the first major Australian designer to break out of Australia. And then there's one of my personal favorites, Lee Sang-bong, who some of you might know Lee Sang-bong, who just opened a meatpacking district store. I think that's going to finally put him on the radar now that he's into his 50s. But I'm sure you've seen the clothes that he's designed for Lady Gaga or the Olympic champion figure skater Kim Yuna. And I think he's also emblematic of the fact that Asian designers above and beyond the Japanese who surfaced during the 70s and 80s are going to become more and more important in the Western world.
Right, so sometimes it wasn't a question of someone who's been neglected by history, but really just refocusing from a purely European and North American viewpoint, just looking out at the rest of the world too.
Anything to add, Ray? Anything you wanted them to?
I was struck by the amount of designers who we haven't heard of or heard a lot about, and I wonder what are some of the reasons? It seems to me that there's not one sort of clear-cut answer for every one of them, obviously. I don't know if it was just they were bad at business or bad at marketing or they rubbed a fashion editor the wrong way or...
I think it could be a combination of all of that.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But also some people's, we could talk about Chanel all night, but her life story is so interesting. So it's almost made her, for example, into like a literary character at the expense of other people that were kind of working around her. And sometimes if they were too successful in business, and I'm thinking about like Lalonde, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who was successful and, a kind of an industry person.
And the chairman of the Couture Association.
Right, that almost works against you because you're not seen as like the weird creative genius that people want of a fashion designer. Mm-hmm. So I think that's another reason.
And there's also the issue of memoirs and biographies and autobiographies, such as so much of the Worth legend came from the Princess Metternich's memoirs of life under the Second Empire, and by his son's book about how great his father was. And there was, heaps of attributions made by both of those. Norman Hartnell wrote a wonderful autobiography, which I think has more veracity to it, but he certainly knows how to spin a story. And
Poiret, of course. He called his book The King of Fashion. So when you are faced with a memoir in which the writer and the subject asserts that claim right from the outset, that's going to have an impact on the way people tell your story.
He himself created most of his own mythology. When he wrote the book, he had become forgotten. And so that's, with all due respect to Monsieur Poiret, that's very much where a lot of that comes from.
Well, even today, these days, we see a lot of designers who have to be personalities. They have to be on Instagram, they have to be on TV, they have to be on Project Runway, what have you. And I hear behind the scenes a lot of resentment about that for designers who might be shy or working hard, but behind the scenes who don't want to be so public. They want to commit to their art. We see a lot of that in the industry and some questioning of the designers who are the most popular, whether they are really the most talented. And so it's something that we're struggling with these days as well.
I think it's a really important issue because there's this idea that designers are celebrities.
Yes. And
so, how much does that distract them from really doing the work?
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
I don't know.
And how important is their Instagram over their actual product?
Right.
It's a very interesting phenomenon.
Right, and I think that kind of ties into another question that I had, that, as you were progressing in the book, the fashion system really, in my opinion, now just moves at almost breakneck speed. And, a lot of these designers are getting exhausted and burnt out because of pre-fall and resort and summer and early summer and the couture shows and this collection and that collection. So how did you really wade through it all and kind of make some of the decisions about, because even when I teach 20th century, as we start getting to the 90s, I'm thinking, oh gosh, I'm too close to this. It's not really exactly history yet. So how do we interpret it?
I think it was tough to write those last few chapters of the book because it's easy for me to look at the 1980s and say, okay, this is historical. Yeah, I can remember a lot of it, but this is an historic thing. And writing about the 90s and the 2000s, Nancy and I both had slightly different perceptions just because of our slightly different life experiences. And I felt that something sort of bubbled to the surface by looking through a whole variety of different sources, and mostly periodicals. But when we went to the 2000s, we really looked at how things were put on the internet, because that's how so much of fashion information was given. And it was difficult, and the story, I think, ended up, at least the story of the 2000s ended up that clothing in the mainstream hasn't really changed much in 30 years in terms of like the dawn of business casual in the 90s. If you go to the Gap, you can buy basically the same t-shirt and button-down shirt that I might have bought in 1995. But on top of that lack of change, we have, like in the macro, we have in the micro this whole celebration of all these different tastes and different looks. And things that might have been a flash in the pan fad in the 80s or the 90s are suddenly like what we call a seasonless fashion basic, right? And like boho was supposed to die. I remember reading boho will be dead by 2007, and then in 2009 there was like, you know, boho editorials going boho in Bohemia. Yeah, and it never left.
No, it was really hard though, and we felt kind of that the number of designers, not even just deciding who was valid, there were so many that indisputably were that had to be included, so that the amount of coverage we were able to give someone would be like 2 sentences. And so we have these, and the story shifted from being, you know, Paris designers, London designers, New York designers, to international and, you know, making space for Australia and making space for Asia. So it was really different, really. And that's something that really happened with the 90s.
Yeah, definitely.
Interesting.
And Ray, as far as fashion reporting, what do you think are the stories that are, you know, most interesting and intriguing, say, in the last 10 years since you've been immersed in the field?
I think, and this also comes up in the book, and it's striking, the amount of designers who are saying that they're being inspired by the street, like how real women are wearing the clothes on the street. And I think it may not be so obvious, but a lot of them are responding to what they feel is an energy that is far away from the images that we have of Dior in the past. Even what Raf Simons was doing recently before he left at Dior was very radical, and a lot of it was inspired by the street. I mean, even those bodysuits that were like the catsuits, excuse me, that were like they were graffiti. It was basically graffiti catsuits, and that's a street as you can be, and for a high-end couture house. And I think a lot of designers are saying they're feeling the influence of the streets, and they don't want everything to be so matchy. And especially women's wear designers. Men's wear is a different story. And I think what they're responding to is the idea that luxury has lost its meaning, and it doesn't. But also the fact that fashion doesn't have to be so elitist. There's been the democratization of fashion is nothing new, but it's just intensified so much that they don't feel the need to speak to the ladies who lunch anymore. And so when you look at images from Balenciaga, they just hired a designer who is as far from what you would think of as the House of Balenciaga. I think the line is Vetements, I think it is. And it's very...
the guy from Vetements, right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's like, and that's, I mean, I think their last show was held in some abandoned church, you know, on the outskirts of Paris that people had to drive 45 minutes to, and it was dank. It was 9 p.m. at night. It was like raging club music, and that's who's going to head Balenciaga. And it's the idea is that Balenciaga, they were looking for somebody who had this street attitude, and so I think fashion is sort of with the democratization and artists like Rihanna, for instance, I think fashion is really feeling that at the moment, and I think we're going to see more of it. I don't think it's going to stop right away.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, it's these kind of moments where you can kind of create this tension where some of the most creative things have happened. And, you know, I think there's instances in the past where, you know, that happened as well with, you know, Yves Saint Laurent, probably quite famously. And
yeah, I mean, I think Diana Vreeland famously said that he had a 50-50 relationship with the street. So he was like seeing what was out there, but also kind of offering it to the street. And I just wanted to make the point that it's in class we've done this kind of exercise of trying to think of something that's out of fashion. And it's almost impossible because for somebody somewhere, like you might read in the magazines of skinny jeans are dead, but like go out on the street, right? That's all you see. Or platforms are over. Again, they're never over.
And that's completely different when we look at like the 1970s, and probably sometime around 1977, there were landfills brimming with mini skirts and leisure suits.
Right.
Because they had been declared out, and they went out.
Right.
Well, right now, we fashion writers, because we're so used to writing about this is the trend, and we're having a very hard time right now doing that because there's less and less one driving trend. It's a multitude of trends and several things happening, and nothing is really out.
Right.
Because this girl is wearing it, and then or these girls, and it's just. It's making our jobs a little harder.
Right.
Yeah, I bet it is because also you can just make something up, right? You can be like a fashion editor of the past and decide something, right? But then there'll be all this objection, right?
Yes,
people
nowadays,
are so empowered to like tell you
exactly.
you're wrong,
right? Whereas before it was handed down,
That's right.
whatever Vogue said was it, and you just obeyed. Yeah.
So it's the new fashion system, right?
Right.
Everything's in. So I had another question about globalization, which was a word that came up a little while ago. And, I often say to my students, fashion and textiles have really always been global. If we think about the Silk Road or we think about the great East India companies founded in the 17th century. But I guess, how do you deal with, or, we could say this massively increased notion of globalization from the 19th and into the 20th century and certainly in the 21st century. And a word that you had used, Nancy, in a discussion was you really wanted to emphasize reciprocal influences. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, this notion of globalization as you addressed modern fashion.
Well, this image that we have on a screen is a great example of our approach. And what it shows, it's a Japanese woodblock print from the late 19th century, and it shows Japanese people at a ballroom. And what they're doing is they've newly adopted Western European style clothing, and they're practicing ballroom dancing. So this was an example for us, and in fact, this was our the closing of our first chapter. This was the last image to show again that idea of transition.
And at several chapters throughout the book, we actually have a section towards the end called The Growth of the Fashionable World, about how what we stereotype as being only Western and Western European and North American fashion starts to permeate through other places.
And then we have more kind of, straightforward depictions of a kind of an orientalizing tendency in fashion. For example, this illustration of a beautiful Paquin theater coat and then the way it was portrayed in 1912 in a fashion illustration. So this is a much more kind of conventional, like Europe looking at Asian models and adopting some of these motifs in fashion.
But the roundel motifs on the coat were actually derived from Japanese heraldic emblems. And one of my personal favorites, opera star Lily Pons, who made millions of dollars for the Metropolitan Opera during the Depression and is credited with actually saving the Metropolitan Opera from bankruptcy. I don't know if that's truth or spin, but nonetheless, in the role of Lakme, where she played an Indian princess, she wore these bare midriff costumes made with authentic fabrics. And not only was her midriff a box office sensation, but she strongly influenced Indian motifs, ideas, including bare midriffs, into high fashion. Schiaparelli, Valentina both did sari-inspired dresses. Valentina made some of her clothes. Also, after this, you'll see a number of bare midriff dresses, often in films like Joan Crawford in The Women, and Ingrid Bergman in Notorious, and Barbara Stanwyck in The Lady Eve. Suddenly, the midriff is the new cleavage or something.
And then we deal with Anna May Wong, too, who was really fashionable and was said, just as an aside, to have the most beautiful hands in Hollywood. And here she is in Travis Banton, one of Travis Banton's versions of a cheongsam, very exotic way of dealing with kind of global influence.
And then we have Dorothy Lamour, who was in a movie where her first big starring role was in a film called The Jungle Princess, in which the Caucasian New Orleans native played a Malayu woman living in the jungle with a pet tiger. And the costume designer, Edith Head, took the indigenous garment of Malaysia and what was the Dutch East Indies, what is now Indonesia, the sarong, and adapted it, and she became known as the Sarong Queen for the rest of her career as she repeatedly played these Asiatic characters.
And you mentioned that we cover children's wear and menswear, and that was fun. And so we were really pleased to find this simplicity pattern with a Nehru jacket for a little boy from the 1960s. So this was like a fun one to include.
And then by the last two chapters of the book, we actually have a very specifically sizable sections on Asian fashion influence going both ways, designers that are becoming prominent, and pop stars, popular actors and actresses such as Gong Li becoming celebrated as a great beauty like Garbo in the fashion press. And that took us to K-pop and the related things, and just the influence of how Western street style is getting reinterpreted in countries like Japan, Korea, Philippines, Indonesia, and then coming back to us with their own flavor. As we see, this is definitely a take on westernized clothing that we see here. And notice they're all holding their devices. This was actually an advertisement for a cellular phone company. Yeah. So.
Great. So, Ray, any thoughts on the global nature of fashion? Does it make your job a challenge?
It's funny. It's especially in this era where we're like, we know more and we're more sensitively aware of things. Sometimes this gets designers in trouble. I know that the Costume Institute at the Met recently did a tribute to China, basically.
Right.
I forget what it was called.
China through the looking glass.
China through the looking glass, right? And the Costume Institute Gala every year is like the party of the year. And so people were supposed to dress to the theme. And so people were very nervous that people were going to take that too literally, like chopsticks in their hair. And some people did go there. But fashion has this uneasy relationship when it tries to sort of, they claim to want to respect the culture, but sometimes if they're not careful, it can get you into trouble. And so Valentino recently had a collection that they said was inspired by Africa in their press notes, and some were worried that it was going to be spears. And and to their credit, they managed to walk that line and do it in a respectful way. And so it's just a very tricky area, and some designers are going to get it right, and some won't, and they'll be called on it. Though that's the difference; they'll be called on it immediately these days. So.
Yes, I think you're right. We talk in the book about people, and I'm thinking of Schiaparelli. First of all, having been influenced by the Exposition Coloniale in Paris in the 1930s. But her influence was kind of looking at everything and like putting it together in a way that today people would maybe not accept as being, it would be seen as inauthentic or something like that.
I remember some Zandra Rhodes painted fabric things that she did when she was visiting Australia in the 1970s, and they were highly praised. And then when there was an exhibition put up by the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in like 2007, she was strongly derided for using these motifs that she got from the Aborigines.
Wow.
So it's a constantly changing thing, right? And I find that it's hard, where the line of demarcation is very blurry. When we had the recent protests over the kimono at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, there was the recent appropriation of the Inuit parka that some of you may have seen in the news, which I think is going to start my semester in World Dress Class in January. And so it's issues like that I think we can't quite find the right dividing line yet. I think we're still in the adolescence of reacting to that.
But that also just goes to prove our point that, fashion is like this kind of flashpoint for all these cultural issues, that a lot of things that are happening out there, they often come back to what we think about in clothes. So
Great. Well, let's see here. Looking at my list, I think that Nancy and Daniel, that you guys really were searching high and low for fantastic things to include in the book. And I see that you have a few things from some small, lesser-known collections that I'm really dying to see. So did you find a few gems from unexpected places?
We did. One that was really useful to us was the McCord Museum of Canadian History, who had some amazing mannequin shots of traditional, in 19th century clothes that were not overstyled. Sometimes you find mannequin shots and they're all, and it's just like horrifying because it does a disservice to the dress. And so several points early on in the book, we have got some of their clothing and a photograph from their collection. Here's one. This is from the Case Western Reserve Historical Society. And I've never seen this illustrated outside of one little publication of theirs from the 1980s, and this is a princess line bodice from Charles Frederick Worth around 1882.
Wow!
And using it in the crop with all of this hand detail on it. I think Nancy used the word artifact, I think, when we chose it, because it's such a work of art. Did you want to?
Wow.
No, I just think it's almost, look at it in the book. It's hard to see with so many lights on, but it is just extraordinary in terms of what it represents in workmanship. So I think that's really, it's a treasure.
How emblematic it was of the couture system's premium on handwork during a mechanizing age.
Right. And then this one is a detail of a really beautiful paisley scarf from the Spurlock Museum at the University of Illinois at one of the Illinois campuses. And so that's really nice too, when we're able to kind of showcase a piece from like a university collection.
And then the last one is a painting that I saw when I was in Melbourne, Australia at the National Gallery of Victoria, which we used to illustrate pre-Raphaelite clothing on women because in my research I found there was a big pre-Raphaelite circle in Melbourne, Australia, because the Melbourne intelligentsia felt that made them classy and British to dress like these outre British people. And it was also a collection that's very underrepresented here, and we used a black dress to illustrate Victorian mourning, also from the same collection. So
a really charming example of it.
Great. Those are just a few of the fantastic images in the book. And then I was thinking, as fashion specialists, we're a relatively new field. We're kind of the new kids on the block, so to speak. And I was just wondering, as you put this book together and thinking about fashion history as a discipline or a field and, how it does relate to the humanities, if you wanted to just kind of address that.
You want to go first? You want me to start? It is a new field. I think in Britain, they've been taking the history of dress a little bit more seriously than we have for 100 years or so. But we also have a younger fashion system too, so that's something to keep in mind. I would make the argument that fashion is perhaps the meeting place of many, many things. You can come at it through words, you can come at it through images. People think they're fashion experts because they put on clothes every day, and so we have to grapple with that. But we don't want to, and even though we live in a democratized world of fashion, we don't want to take away from, the great creators of fashion. And we really consider them, it's a different job description, but we have to consider that a fashion designer is in the realm of any other artistic creator. When you are a fashion historian, you have to know so much. You have to know what was going on politically. You have to know about materials. You have to know about who the entertainers were, whether you're working with a court system or a democracy. I mean, there's so many things to think about. So that's why I would argue that it kind of belongs in the sphere of the humanities. And also, you have to know different languages, because if you don't know French, you have a hard time researching fashion. So,
yeah, and when fashion history started in this country a few decades back, it actually developed out of existing home economics departments, right, because the home ec departments taught sewing. So who better to teach fashion history but a home ec teacher, right? And I don't mean to disparage that. My grandmother's degree was in home economics, but what she studied was fashion. Mm-hmm. In her home economics degree. She probably started me on the path where I ended up. But that's, all factors into it. Whereas I think in Britain, it more came out of the curatorial and museum end.
I think art history,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think British art historians were really basically first looking at paintings and using the clothes to kind of date the paintings. So it was really kind of a historical pursuit. Mm-hmm. We also just don't have the idea in America yet, although I think we're starting to get it, that fashion is somehow like cultural patrimony, the way they do, for example, in France and in Italy, where they have this real respect for the heritage of fine craftsmanship and fine dressing. So I think we need to develop that.
I mean, when Yves Saint Laurent passed away, wasn't there I wouldn't call it a state funeral, but it
was practically a state funeral. Yeah, it was amazing.
I know here in America there's been debate about whether fashion is art and whether fashion are artistes, and some designers, I know Michael Kors, for instance, is anti that. He's like, I want to sell clothes, and I'm not an artist, and I'm commercial, and I embrace that C word. But there are other designers who do feel like it's rightfully an art, and a Provenza Schooler, if you ask them, they would consider their stuff almost like worthy of being in a museum, and not just for an exhibition, but just it's that workmanship and craftsmanship.
Well, I want to point out one thing on this, designers, are they artists? Yves Saint Laurent state funeral. Charles James spent a great deal of his adult life living in the Chelsea Hotel and working out of the Chelsea Hotel. Now, I have mixed feelings over James as a designer. However, you go to the Chelsea Hotel, you see all those plaques with the names on them. Charles James is not one of them.
You're right.
And I think that is a travesty.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Interesting. Our controversial field of fashion history. So, Gwyneth, should we open it up to some questions from other people? We would love that.
Hi, I just want to say congratulations. I know you guys have been working on this book forever, and I think it's amazing how inclusive it is on so many levels, really astounding. The question I had was on revivalism. I know that revivalism has been around in fashion for a long time, looking back at other eras, but it seems like today we're always, again, looking back at the 60s or the 70s or the 30s. Did you find a point where this was just picking up at an incredible speed, or was this always something that was really in the background or in the foreground of fashion?
I think in the 90s is when it picks up at an incredible speed. What do you think?
I was going to
Nancy?
say the 70s.
Yeah, okay. So in different ways.
Yeah.
You know, well, I mean, I was just teaching the 60s and 70s the other day, and we see these things that's like, well, it's a little 20s, it's a little 30s, it's a little 40s. And yeah.
And, you know, I say the 1970s because you can look at the 70s and see evidence of like pure 1920s, pure 1930s, 40s. Really, I'm thinking of every decade except the 50s and 60s, really from like the turn of the 20th century all the way through the 40s. Somebody is wearing something that resembles one of those eras in the 1970s, but it's less of kind of mashing things together, which is why you might be saying the 1990s.
Yeah. And then, you know, you look at a decade like the 1930s, whose primary revivalism was not primary. They were doing the turn of the century. They were doing medieval. They were doing Greco-Roman. But then they were using the world as their salad bar. Yeah. So we have Russia. We have the Malay archipelago. We have, you know, all the India. They're all being mixed into the fashion story as well.
Could you guys talk about wasn't sort of mentioned, the relationship of fashion to the other decorative arts? I think that was one of the things about fashion as art. I mean, when I was educated, decorative arts still weren't there. They weren't considered something important to study. And now all that's changed. And when I looked at some of your images, like that 1950, you know, family, and it's like, oh, but that mint green car
is fantastic,
and
right?
the track house. Yeah. It's so much a part of it. And I've noticed something fairly recently that in home decor, publicity and magazine, the colors or something, it's also burgundy. It's what your boots and your scarf, but it's also your throw pillows and maybe one wall. And how do you think the influence back and forth?
I think there is a lot of relation in certain times more than others. I think in the 1920s there's a big bounce back and forth between like apparel and decoration, really all kind of around what we now call Art Deco, you know, kind of geometric and the way materials were and the mixing of metals and things like that. But like less so in other times. What do you think?
I think like maybe less so in the 50s, but it was just all about being luxurious as opposed to things bouncing off each other, with the exception of the relationship between fine art and textile prints. One thing we use in the book is a postmodern teapot in the 1980s that kind of, you know, because we frequently put in one decorative item or a piece of jewelry. We call it the shiny object illustration of each chapter. And although there weren't that many postmodern clothes, certainly not that I remember, it sort of goes along with the over-the-top feeling of so much of the clothing of the 80s. There's this, not necessarily copying, but there is some sort of bounce going on in terms of the statement, I think.
Yeah, sometimes it's in the color palette, sometimes it's more in the forms. Actually, though, that teapot looks like a Katie Pie dress to me.
You're right,
so.
You're right. Yeah.
So it's really like 80s.
Way in the back.
Thank you very much for the discussion. And I wanted to ask a question that comes from some experience I have as an art historian. I'm teaching a seminar right now on frivolity in the Spanish and Portuguese department, and we're engaging a bit in fashion as one of the frivolities. And actually, we have the good fortune of having one of your students in our seminar, and it's been a joy to be in dialogue. And one of the ways that we've been getting at it is through the attention that philosophers have paid to fashion very early. So George Simmel, but also all the way up through, you name a philosopher, and they may very well have a text on fashion. And so I'm wondering if you can help us reflect on the kind of lag of the academy and our disciplines within the academy to kind of catch up on what I think contemporaries at the time, whether they be artists, writers, or philosophers, were paying to to fashion in its different iterations. It strikes me that it's the academy that seems to be out of step with the deep theoretical, philosophical reflections that at least a smattering of writers have been making since at least the turn of the century forward. And yet when I think those of us outside of fashion history dapple, we're very much amateurs and novices in trying to understand really what those philosophers are talking about. I'm hoping now with your book that we can, shore up on our history, right? Because I think sometimes we're reading those texts in a vacuum, and I would just love your reflections on the kind of poaching that we outside of art history love to do when we talk about things like mass culture and the avant-garde, but also what your experience as writers have been in engaging with the other related bibliographies that are certainly part of this extended history of fashion.
You want me to take this one?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, we decided that this would not be a theoretical book, and because we both feel really firmly that you need to have your history before you can kind of engage with theory. Which is not to say that we didn't keep kind of certain theories of how to tell a story in mind, because we definitely did. And one of those ideas, I think, is would be like Carolyn Evans's idea of history as a labyrinth, that it's not this kind of straight trajectory, but at any time, at any moment, time is kind of bending back and kind of standing next to a previous period, running parallel for a while, and then kind of breaking off. But to answer your question about why the Academy hasn't really taken fashion seriously, because I think that's kind of what you were asking. I think a certain amount has to do with the fact that in different parts of the world it has. But here again in America, fashion is an industry. And even though it's, I believe, second only to the energy industry in its the amount of resources devoted to it, it's been seen primarily as a women's industry. And so I would have to say there's been a certain amount of sexism at play in the kind of suppression of fashion as a serious discipline. So a combination of this idea that it's an industry, and also that it's, we don't perhaps analyze industry other than in a business school setting. I don't know, does that answer at all your question?
And also, fashion theory, as opposed to just fashion history, is yet another thing on which I think the British are leading us by a decade or two. So,
yeah, we need to do some work, people.
Hi, my question is, how do you think gender identity is influencing fashion today?
Well, we decided not to use the phrase both genders in our later chapters. That's one thing, because we feel that is much more of a fluid notion. A lot of designers are showing, and more recent, our book ends at 2010, and I think this is the last couple years type of thing. But
I've already made some notes on that topic for the second edition, which will take us further, because I think it's unavoidable. I mean, it is unavoidable. And I haven't yet to see that in retailing too much. I mean, there have been unisex clothes. You can, buy a hoodie that either a man or a woman or someone in more gender fluidity could all buy that same garment. But let's look at the outrage that was caused by, was it Target that merged the girls' and the boys' toys together?
Yes.
Yeah. Whoa. We're reacting to putting Barbie next to a truck like that in our country. That's kind of crazy.
It is really crazy.
So what the future for that effect on fashion, I can't really answer that question. I've been sort of waiting to see how it evolves so that I can write about it from a historical aspect, because I don't want to predict anything there.
And we also don't want to wear like unisex stuff either,
and
like Marimekko, leisure suits or anything.
I have several transgendered friends, and every now and then I'll ask them questions, and they're like, "I wear what I like," is usually the answer I get. So, yeah.
Well, we had an instance of Kanye West pushing the envelope by wearing Celine blouses. Celine is, okay, I don't have to explain, sorry. And while the fashion industry, the high fashion industry applauded him, if you went on Twitter and just saw like quote unquote regular people, they were basically assaulting him for it. It was like, what are you doing? And I think, like you said, as far as seeing it in retail, like I don't, maybe Barney's is an exception where you might see a hood by air skirt and a bra for men, but beyond that, I think it's still a runway phenomenon that might take a while, if ever, to sort of mainstream it, if you will, into the retail environment. But it's out there. I mean, Givenchy has been pushing that envelope for a while. Tom Brown has been pushing that envelope for a long while in his menswear. And so
Anderson, what's his name? Last name?
Jonathan Anderson. Yes, of course. That's
right.
a really good example. J.W. Anderson.
J.W. Anderson, right.
Is a really good example. So it's definitely out there, and it's not going away. I just don't know when it's going to be mainstream.
I think I went to H&M, though, and there is this one section where a lot of the stuff is dark and it's very loose, and I really thought they were trying out something that could be for both.
Interesting.
Or not even both, but for anybody, let's say. So, and I don't know if anybody knows the inside story of H&M, but when I go back, I'm going to take another look. So.
Yeah, actually about the relationship between mainstream fashion and runway fashion, I was just wondering how you approached that synergy in the book, since very often I read fashion reviews because I'm very interested in fashion and everything, but I don't have the same outlook on the work of, say, J.W. Anderson as a regular person who just sees boys wearing feminine clothes. So I was wondering how you approach that relationship between what you actually see on the street and what you see up on the runways, and the difference, the distance between both worlds in the book.
I think what we kind of decided was, especially in the 1990s and the 2000s, runway, and we tried to convey this, that runway is almost its own world, that a lot of people get fashion information now right off the runway because of, social media. But people know that it's frivolity or its concept, or it's kind of like those concept cars that they show at the car show that are kind of this, like the best case scenario, but they're never going to really make it onto the road. But people look at them the way they look at the runway just for inspiration. So that's how we dealt with it, just by acknowledging that.
And the disparity between the runway and what was actually being sold, at least on the couture level, doesn't really start until the late 1960s, where you see Courrege's metal dresses going down the runway, and no one was buying them, but Diana Vreeland would put them in vogue. And that phenomenon grew and grew and grew throughout the 1970s, and in the 70s there was an Yves Saint Laurent collection that Diana Vreeland said, not a lot of women are going to wear these clothes, but women all over the world will think these clothes. So very much it's about creating a mood, and then as the runways turned into much more circus acts, coming from Galliano and Victor and Rolf and McQueen into the next 2 decades, it really became about getting a lot of press and selling the perfume.
And increasingly handbags too.
Yeah, and the it bags, and the it bags. Yeah, absolutely.
just continuing that line of thought, since the runway is in some ways no longer a space for designers to market real clothes, does that signal a kind of crisis in, how designers think of themselves? And has the runway really crossed into theater rather than any relevance to what people are wearing? There's such a disconnect there that I wonder, how designers have reconceptualized themselves in their shows in light of this new phenomenon, whatever it is.
Right, whatever it is. I mean, I think, we're going to ask for Ray's help on this one, because you're covering this. You're out there.
Sure, that's a good question, and you touched a bit upon it. It's a lot of it is image building, and in this age of social media, if it looks good on Instagram, that gets buzz, and even if the people clicking don't buy that dress that was featured, they're going to buy something, whether it's the perfume or the shoes or a more affordable dress from that line. But designers will even admit that they stage their runway shows according to what the best iPhone camera angle is going to be, because that's what it is today. It's about brand building and image building, and the runway clothes, if they're flashy and editorial enough, and the magazines will shoot them because they're aspirational, and but the goal isn't necessarily to sell those clothes that you see on the runway. It's a brand building exercise. It's a very expensive one too, and it may be losing its effectiveness though. I mean, that's still being debated. I mean, Tom Ford decided not to show his clothes on a physical runway. He filmed his runway show, and it was a video albeit with Lady Gaga, but it was just, the idea is, there's a lot of questions about whether the runway is effective anymore, an effective vehicle.
Also, what you see on the runway from the American designers tends to be the clothes that they want to sell. Whereas you go and see a runway show in most Parisian houses, especially the ones that are trying to be edgy, and it's a theatrical performance.
That's a really good point. Yeah. That's a really good point.
Yeah, there's a big difference. And I think if you saw the Ralph Simmons show that's at the end of the Dior and I movie, and I really do encourage everybody to see that movie, but it is
amazing.
It's a breathtaking spectacle, and it really makes you, first of all, it makes you want to throw everything you have out and just buy all these new beautiful clothes. But it really does, it makes this point that fashion is something so special at that level. It
also celebrates the original Christian Dior aesthetic, which I will dare say had been missing at that house for many years. So it's a pity he's not still there.
Right.
And then I think, I don't know if anybody else chimes in or agrees, when you're looking at these runway shows, certain aspects of collections do get picked up by the technical designers at various design houses, and little bits of couture kind of trickles down with, even companies like Zara and the fast fashion companies. Definitely. And it's almost instantaneous that you might see a little blouse from, a Celine collection than on 6th Avenue in the window. So
definitely, yeah, colors or a mood or a detail or something.
Right.
Something to kind of keep it moving, keep it moving along.
Exactly.
We have time for one more question. Okay. Is there someone, a new one?
Hi.
Hi.
I would love it if you could just talk about the photo you did select for the cover. I loved the other one, but it's so stunning, and I just would love to hear a little bit about how you chose it.
Okay, actually, Nancy and I came up with 6 different choices, ranging from, I think, the 40s up through the 90s. And there was one black and white Claire McCardle I really liked, because Claire McCardle's my favorite designer. But anyway, the editor came back with that one, which had not been one of our original choices, and they liked our other choices, but they felt that one was going to be useful. It was because they wanted something that looked good in a thumbnail as well as looking good on the book. And I started going through Amazon, and I was like, yep, they are totally right, because when it's an interesting cover, but I can't tell what it is from the thumbnail, I don't feel like clicking on it. And we have been doing pretty well on Amazon, and so, we love it. What's interesting about that is it's Christian Dior, who is, kind of recurs, of course, prominently throughout the book, as he should. We like the drama of the pose, which was similar to some of the images that we chose. Also, they cropped it, and it's like a waltz-length dress, and her feet look really awkward in the original photo, and the crop made it so much
really
more
elevated.
Elevated it. And so, at first we were like, oh, they didn't pick one of our choices, and then we were looking at it, and we were like, this is fabulous.
So, well, yeah, thank you everyone for coming. It's been a wonderful evening.